There was once a farmer who kept his future in a small leather pouch, seeds packed by hand, each one a promise of bread and shelter for the seasons ahead. He lived in a narrow valley where neighbors rose with the sun and the soil learned their names, and everyone understood that tomorrow's table was earned by today's restraint. Soon, the pouch itself would become a question in the quiet of the night. The farmer's house was simple: a low roof, a hearth that kept its best stories, and a belly that sometimes forgot the names of comfort. Like many, he had learned to measure hope by what remained after hunger. Some say he was not careless, but that seasons of lean had taught him the taste of scarcity so well that it lingered even in plenty. That lingering would bend his choices one cold evening. At the market, the farmer walked among others who sold cloth, herbs, and stories, and he listened as tales of good years braided into boasts and warnings. Yet when he returned, the pouch was still his only surety. He watched children with bellies full and elders trading grain for gossip, and wondered if preserving seeds for spring was wiser than answering a cold question in his own mouth. That question kept him awake as wind kept the candle flickering. That night, cold like an old habit, the farmer sat with his pouch on his knee and counted not the seeds but the empty spaces in his belly. And he told himself a story where one meal would be harmless and tomorrow would always come. It is told that at midnight he unstitched a seam and tasted the first seed, sweet and raw like regret, wrapped in necessity, and yet the warmth of it made the dark less severe. Morning would demand proof of his choice. When the first seed passed his lips, it tasted like more than hunger. It tasted like a permission he had never given himself, and for an hour the cold retreated and the hearth seemed nearer. He told himself it was a one-time thing, that restraint could be resumed as easily as a plow turning soil, and so he kept the pouch lighter and his conscience quieter. The pouch was lighter, and the night grew longer with a secret to carry. As weeks passed, the farmer discovered a dangerous arithmetic. One seed today felt like one less worry tomorrow, and the pouch answered his cold nights with small mercies until nights no longer felt so cold. The habit grew with the seasons, not as a thunderbolt, but as a slow erosion, and he began to confuse survival for stewardship until the pouch held fewer promises than the memory of meals. Soon, the fields would notice his absence in spring. A neighbor once asked why his furrows seemed less certain, and the farmer shrugged with a smile that folded like old cloth, answering that some seasons are quiet while the land sleeps. He did not speak of the pouch because people measure shame in words. Some say the neighbor saw the secret in the farmer's hands and chose silence, for those who live by the soil often protect each other's fragile reckonings. Silence can be a soft cloak until spring lifts it off. When the season for planting arrived, the farmer touched the soil and felt it ask for something he could not offer, and in that moment the cost of comfort became as clear as a furrow in rain. The seeds were gone, or too few to keep one row alive. His hands, once steady with purpose, trembled like a rope in wind, and he finally understood that the meals he had claimed were debts that the land would collect. The planting would be sparse, and the year would answer with a thin harvest. Spring came, like a ledger opened, and where the farmer had meant to plant abundance, there were empty patches that the sun could not fill with promise. Every birdsong seemed to count what remained and what had been eaten in secret. He walked the rows and felt the difference between what might have been and what was, and the valley held its breath as if listening for a verdict. The verdict would be a small, hard harvest and a lesson that time keeps its own sums. He tried to make the thin harvest stretch like a borrowed loaf, trading small portions in the market and speaking gently to his children, so worry would not find its voice too soon, and for a time the village accepted his hush as a fragile kind of prudence. But borrowed time demands interest, and as the months wore on, the interest collected in fewer seeds, colder nights, and a neighbor's pitying gaze. The collection would not relent. When a drought circled the valley and the storehouses gave only thin comfort, the elders called a small council and spoke of sharing, foresight, and what happens when one family's night becomes the village's worry. They did not shame him publicly, but they used his story as a quiet lesson about the danger of living entirely from today. Some said the farmer had not stolen food, but had traded the future for a fleeting comfort. The council left him with words that would seed his regret. A neighbor offered a handful of seeds, not as charity, but as a test of resolve, and the farmer accepted with gratitude that tasted like ash, because each borrowed kernel came with an invisible claim on future autonomy. Planting those seeds felt like planting a promise with strings attached. He knew he had to learn stewardship or else remain forever owing to seasons and sympathies. The field would show whether the lesson had taken root. Over the next years, the farmer learned to hold steadier hands, sowing small and honest rows and letting patience stretch where greed had once tightened his fingers. And the land answered with modest returns that carried a new dignity. It is said that the hardest lessons are those that bloom slowly, and so the farmer tended them like a fragile sapling, turning away from nightly temptations in favor of steady labor and shared meals. This slow growth would lead to a return of trust in unexpected ways. Neighbors began to trade with him again, not because his past was forgiven in a single day, but because steady work and steady promises are visible like fence posts against a field, and reliability draws its own harvest. He shared his tools and taught his children the ledger of seasons. Sow a seed, tend it, wait, and never eat tomorrow's seed for tonight's comfort. The valley learned that trust is regrown like a field, furrow by furrow. When a final lean winter came, the farmer no longer had to choose between eating the future and protecting it, for he had learned to store a little, share a little, and ask before he took, and that discipline kept his family quieter and more full than before. The memory of the pouch he had once unstitched lived on, but it had become a cautionary tale in the village, a whisper that helped others measure their nights. The winter passed with fewer regrets than the first time he had answered hunger with seeds. Years later, the farmer would walk the finished rows and think of the little leather pouch and the night that bent his life, and he would speak those memories aloud so that the valley's children might know a simple truth. Time is a ledger, and seeds eaten now are debts drawn against tomorrow. The parable ends not in a curse, but in a gentle instruction. What you take from the future must be repaid by courage and care, and the field will remember both. The end of his story is also the start of the lesson for anyone who would listen.